President Joe Biden is commuting the sentences of roughly 1,500 people who were released from prison and placed on home confinement during the COVID pandemic. The president is also pardoning 39 Americans convicted of nonviolent crimes. This is the largest single-day act of clemency in modern history.
We're also told that these are individuals who had been rehabilitated into their families and had been serving the community in some way, that were working to make the community safer.
We have a lot to say about President Biden's first list of pardon and clemency awards, but for all of the much-deserved criticisms of his decisions so far, at least this isn't happening.
Federal executions have become commonplace under the Trump administration. 10 people have been put to death since July, with 3 more executions scheduled before President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in. A recent article published by ProPublica reports that in the Trump administration's rush to carry out these executions, it, quote, trampled over an array of barriers, both legal and practical. And in your reporting, Isaac, you found that the Trump administration paid private executioners in cash and bought drugs from secret companies to carry out these executions.
Well, the reason for using private contractors to actually conduct the executions, we don't have an answer to. That's another one of these instances where the government has just not given the public an explanation for why it made the decisions that it did. As for the secrecy, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the old drug that became unavailable because of the public pressure. And so the government really wants to guard the identities of its suppliers because it knows that if they were to become public, that public exposure would lead to public pressure that could cause them to back out, and the government wouldn't be able to go through with this anymore.
Donald Trump's execution spree to end his first term was nothing short of a barbaric, cruel, and immoral use of his and the government's power. Now, Biden is no humanitarian himself, given his unwavering support, material backing, and laundering of the Israeli government's war crimes and human rights violations. But he does have the perfect opportunity to at least make some things right on the domestic front. So far, as expected, he hasn't done nearly enough.
In 2011, Conahan was sentenced to 17 and a half years for accepting nearly $3 million in kickbacks for sending 2,300 children, some as young as 8 years old, to for-profit prisons on false charges.
You heard that right. Notorious Kids for Cash scandal judge Michael Conahan just had his 17-year sentence commuted, a small price to pay for upending the lives and traumatizing thousands of children and their families.
We're talking about sending thousands of kids to for-profit detention facilities, many of whom were first-time offenders who probably should have had community service or some sort of slap on the wrist, and instead they were sent to a detention facility for months, in some cases years. Michael Conahan willingly did this. He knew about it. He purposely blocked a county government facility being built so that these for-profit centers could be built. Some of the cash kickbacks were delivered as cash in a shoebox or routed through a Florida condo that he and the other judge set up to funnel money.
For how cartoonishly evil Conahan and his co-conspirators' actions are, it is truly mind-boggling that Joe Biden would make this decision, especially after hearing just one testimonial from the victims of the scheme. This is Sandy Fonzo, the mother of one of the victims of the Kids for Cash scheme orchestrated by Conahan and former judge Mark Ciavarella, who was initially sentenced to a juvenile detention center for 8 months after being caught at an underage drinking party during his senior year of high school. He would later be sent to another center after his first release, spending almost a year in state custody for violating probation despite being found not guilty on that second set of charges.
Hearing and having to relive all of this, I mean, this is just reopen wounds that have never healed, and this is very, very difficult, very, very heavy. I shouldn't be having to relive this, especially at Christmas time. I mean, this is just, it's unacceptable. He couldn't look you in the eye. I don't know what happened in that facility. My son was a very big, strong, proud boy. And he came out broken. I don't know what happened. I try to not think about what happened, and he would never talk about it, but something not good happened to him in there. It just never ended. It just snowballed. It changed him. It broke him. It stole his youth, his childhood. He would never, ever recover. And it just became too much, and he shot himself in the heart. And we were fighting this. We knew something was not right. We could not get into that courtroom with media. Anything that was trying to be done was shot down.
Just for a second, think about how you would feel if one of the men directly responsible for your child ending their life solely so he could enrich himself and his friends was let off the hook by the most powerful man in the world. Not only is it a massive slap in the face to rehash trauma that will never heal, as Fonzo alluded to, but it explicitly reinforces the fact that our country does not care about actual justice, but rather the maintenance of the appearance that justice is being administered, when in reality, the system was designed to benefit and protect the ruling class of politically connected, wealthy people. We implore you to watch Amy Goodman's full interview with Sandy Fonzo at the link in the description box below, and we can't thank Fonzo enough for having the courage to speak truth to power like she has for years now in defending her son's humanity from the people who stripped it away. And speaking of corruption at the local level, Biden also commuted the sentence of Rita Crundwell, the former comptroller of Dixon, Illinois, who was convicted of stealing a staggering $53 million from her community dating back to the early 90s after pleading guilty to the embezzlement scheme in the year 2012. She siphoned off city tax dollars to fund her horse breeding business, multiple properties, personal credit cards, and other luxuries while faking paperwork and lying to her colleagues to cover her tracks. Regardless of her being released from prison in 2021 and serving the rest of her sentence in home confinement, commuting her sentence sends a clear message to one of, if not the most politically corrupt state in the country at the local level, that stealing a massive percentage of a city's budget isn't an act of violence and does pay when it's all said and done. It just takes some time. Other lowlights of Biden's clemency and pardon list include former Alabama doctor and pill mill operator Shelinder Agarwal, who pleaded guilty to writing illegal prescriptions for opioids and committing Medicare fraud back in 2016. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison in 2017. At the height of his racket, the DOJ claims that his practice was the highest Medicare prescriber of opioid painkillers in the entire country. But now he walks free. We can keep going with examples of Biden's comically poor use of his clemency powers, but we have to mention clemency candidates who legitimately deserve it.
The president needs to send a clear message to our society that deep-pocketed corporations, that polluters like Chevron, will not be able to weaponize the law to try to silence lawyers and advocates who hold them accountable. This affects all advocacy in our society. If we are going to have the space to hold corporations accountable in the United States of America, the president must pardon me and send a message that this will never happen again.
And Chevron, used its corporate wealth and its legal connections to target Steven Donzinger and to ignore the contamination it left behind in Ecuador.
Environmental and human rights lawyer and activist Steve Donzinger would be a great place to start.
Well, Leonard Peltier was an organizer and an activist of the American Indian movement that helped fight for the Native American Freedom of Religion Act, that helped fight for the Indian Self-Determination Act, that we're fighting for many of the things that we are beneficiary of today as Indigenous people. And they were fighting for liberation of people and the rebuilding of Indigenous nations. Also, he was doing so, organizing as a boarding school survivor, raising awareness about what was happening at that time in Indian country. And so he created the conditions, many of the things that we benefit from today throughout Indian country, but he has never been able to benefit from them himself.
The same goes for Leonard Peltier, who we've talked about on this platform for years now. He just turned 80, and he spent 50 years in custody for a crime he says, his defense says, and even some who fought against him in the case say he didn't commit.
But I'm not. I'm no different from anybody else. I don't have special skills. I'm just another guy who sits there day to day in the office, watches what's happening, and goes, this is something that's not our place to decide. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong. And I'm willing to go on the record to defend the authenticity of them and say, I didn't change these. I didn't modify the story. This is the truth. This is what's happening. you should decide whether we need to be doing this.
And of course, we could not forget Edward Snowden.